When I say I have a problem with a company and not the game it's hosting, it's not a free pass to claim I'm mean to the game because of who hosts it. Some of my favorite games are hosted and run by terrible people. Still, there's just something about Nexon that gets to me so much that I need to mention it every time I cover their games. Especially when they're this SUPAH KAWAII! The perfect storm of Nexonitis and weeby fanaticism. It's not a heads up for the people who are inevitably going to take offense to that statement, but more for the casual viewer who might wonder why there's such a shitstorm going on in the comments section. And there is no greater example of this kind of thing than our next game. I had heard a lot about this game, and I'd gotten plenty of suggestions, even early on, so I figured it might be time to actually check out what this is all about. This is the MMO Grinder, and it's time to look at DRAGONEST. DRAGONEST, brought to you by the ever-wonderful Nexon, is a 3D action MMO that plays more like a 3D beat-em-up. Think something like a SUPAH KAWAII version of Vindictus. You know, something you'd have expected the prequel of Mabinogi to actually look like. And you'll be on the right track. Radical combat, but flashy skills and plenty of enemy fodder to plow through. The story of the game is actually rather fascinating if you're willing to pay attention to it. It takes a rather interesting approach to it as well, having each class in the game take on a unique perspective of the same overarching narrative, and having their own individual issues and contributions to it along the way. Let's get moving and see what lies within the Dragon Nest. Personally, my money's on dragons. The game is far more visually impressive than any screenshot could possibly show. Things that in a majority of MMOs would have had far lower quality tend to shine through here, with special mention going to the commissions board, which has each piece of paper modeled and textured to the point that you can actually read them, and they flap gently with the breeze. The water effects, especially in the first major town, look fantastic, even though they only reflect the world and not the characters. This is why I'm so utterly baffled by the facial textures that look so low-res and out of place that it looks like each playable character is wearing a flat paper mask drawn on in crayon. It's a serious sore spot in an otherwise fantastic presentation, and it's something I just can't get past. It's also difficult to get a good view of your character, as the game uses a depth of field effect that renders your close objects blurry, as if you're focusing your eye on the background. Interesting, but frustrating, and I'm certain more than a few Nexonites are going to claim this is something I can shut off if I don't like it, as if that somehow negates the fact it exists. Even the animations have subtle touches that didn't need to be there and might go unnoticed. One of my personal favorites being that all NPCs in the game will turn their heads towards you as you near them. Granted, you get that kind of creepy horror movie vibe when they only rotate their heads and their gaze stays fixed on you as you walk past them, but hey, it's something to make the world feel more alive. Effects details are also on the high side. With the game being essentially an MMO brawler, the effects are as bombastic, flashy, and brutal as you'd might expect. Lightning lets out loud crackles and shows off the skeletons of electrocuted enemies. Assassin's skills have an otherworldly bluish glow and are very crisp, while Sorcerer's skills come in a myriad of colors, responding to different elements and tend to be very flashy and explosive. Other fun touches to the world can be seen simply by looking around. You might find a caged creature bashing its head into the top of the cage repeatedly, only to notice that the key on the top of this cage is bouncing with every hit. Notice the amusing way that the forges keep their fire stoked, by hanging bait above some bellows as the animals on top of them keep leaping at that bait in futility. Feel free to take in the sights. You'll realize there's more to discover than you'd think. Surprisingly, given just how intense and impactful the sounds of combat can be, everything feels rather flat and generic. Sure, when you actually manage to hit your target and see them recoil in pain with a comic book-like wham or thud, the sound design seems fantastic. There's also some intricate sounds, such as the light crackling of electricity from the priest attacks, the cycling action of the Tinkerer's weapons, and the crazed laughter of the shinobi, which should be experienced at least once. In general, though, when either missing your target or testing out what each skill does, you'll quickly notice that everything feels very generic. Special mention goes to the Tinkerer's class, whose weapon fire sounds kind of disappointingly weak, especially when compared to the massive cannon that she'll lug around in combat. Of course, this is one of those special few Korean games with English voice acting, and while it isn't fully voice acted, with most interactions taking place in the usual dialogue box, there are still some gems here. Surprisingly, the voice acting is mostly good, and even though you can find some really terrible phoned-in work, the average quality is unusually high, with special mention going to the Lancia for easy as pie shouted in the most violently homicidal way possible. In fact, just listening to the NPCs as you speak to them can be amusing, as many have lines that come out of nowhere, and a lot of characters can be generally jerkish to you, yet in a manner that still comes across as hilarious.
Remember, if you ever need anything, ask someone else.
Of course, there's some that just come across as unhinged.
I want to go for a ride, but the horses don't let me ride them. Like Irene totally deserves to die.
I'm sorry, what? This brings us to a nagging issue, though. Characters have a set dialogue for specific attacks, and while these can be amusing at first, they'll quickly grow tiresome, especially if associated with an attack you'll use frequently. The music also seems to kind of fall in this rut, being largely forgettable with special exceptions for a few tracks. The first is a K-pop song done by Tiny G, though your taste in K-pop will clearly dictate your level of that enjoyment. In addition to that, there are songs composed by a YouTube content creator by the name of Erutan, also known as Kate the Great 19, who worked on 2 separate tracks for the game. Sadly, if you aren't playing the SEA versions of the game, which has other changes that we'll talk about later, you won't even get to hear those tracks, making this a clear case of bring your own soundtrack. Quick warning for anyone getting the game through Steam. The game seems really fickle about launching. Virtually every time I attempted to launch the game through Steam, Nexon's launcher would crash and force a retry. Usually more than once would do the trick, but there were occasions of being booted from the launcher several times before I was able to enter my login information. Just something to watch out for. When you first start the game, you'll be taken to a brief animated character selection screen. Unlike many traditional MMOs, Dragonest has classes that are directly tied to specific characters that you can choose from. You can keep in mind that classes will advance into new classes twice, at level 15 and level 45. They must be advanced down to one of 2 mutually exclusive trees, so it'd be wise to plan ahead, as these advanced classes have very different playstyles. The character selection screen does offer a brief preview of the level 15 class change to help in this regard, but level 45 classes aren't shown at all. Once you've made your selection, you'll be presented with the character creator and almost immediately notice how very limited it is. There's very few hair, face, and eye color options to choose from, so don't be surprised if you see other characters in your class look exactly like you. Weird, blurry faces and all. Afterwards, you'll be dumped directly into the tutorial with an opening cinematic to briefly explain your character's role within that world. Note that not all classes will begin in the same village, so if you and your friends want to play together, you might have to wait until you reach the first unified town known as Carderock Pass. Don't worry too much about not playing together at the start, as the game is incredibly easy, but we'll get onto more of that later on. When starting the game, you'll notice the usual WoW-codified exclamation marks above an NPC's head, denoting a quest that the player can take. Early on, the quests are designed with a very strict linear progression, so you only need to worry about a single quest at a time before you reach Carderock Pass. Combat in Dragonest is very much in the beat-em-up style, rewarding high combo chains, stringing together multiple attacks, avoiding enemy attacks, and essentially being as stylish as possible, which will grant you an experience boost at the end of the dungeon. You shouldn't worry too much about the game's overall difficulty though, as mechanics are easy to grasp and the game is almost insultingly easy, even on the hardest difficulty settings. Apparently this isn't supposed to be the case, as players of the SEA version report that with the AI working properly, the game is actually rather challenging, and while we didn't confirm this for ourselves, it is something to keep in mind. The leveling system is quirky. No training is needed to purchase new skills or level up existing ones. The skill trees have multiple layers of prerequisites, and some advanced classes have basic level requirements in addition to their own. What adds to the oddity of this is that there are just too many skills for some classes. The hotbars are easily filled with useful skills, leaving behind skills that would be useful if there were more hotbar spaces. And useless skills get used as dumping grounds for points to get better skills in higher classes, and all of that before you ever unlock your level 45 elite class. This game really could have used the second hotbar to alleviate this problem, and while some could argue it allows for more diversity in character builds, it feels more like you aren't given enough space to make good use of your class-specific talents. Fortunately, unlike almost every other MMO on the market, Dragonest distinctly separates PvE stats and PvP stats, so a nerf to the PvP for balance reasons won't negatively affect everyone just because someone complained. Honestly, more companies should adopt this model, as it ensures that PvE won't be hindered because of another aspect of the game. It might seem odd to use the term dungeon so early, but this game is very instant, and almost every single quest taking place within a dungeon of some description. If you're familiar with Dungeons & Dragons Online, you'll find a similar system here, though unlike DDO, you'll find each and every instant functions much in the same way, usually consisting of 3 different loading zones requiring you to kill a set of spawns of enemies to advance, and then culminating in a boss fight before you exit. Each time you complete a dungeon, you'll be given a ranking, to the highest seen in Grindstone being SS. This ranking takes into account your highest combo chain, time spent in the dungeon, enemies defeated, and difficulty selected. Once you have a ranking, you can choose between one of 4 random chests, with better chests added to the random lineup based upon that ranking. Along the way, you may have various quests to complete in addition to killing the final boss, though these are rather well telegraphed and really just require replaying the same dungeon over and over, as new quests will unlock at various progression points and levels within the story. As mentioned in the intro, the storyline itself is dependent on your class and can dramatically change not only how your story unfolds, but how the NPCs will react to you, even what bosses you fight in the dungeons. This is usually a good thing, giving each class a reason to be played, so you can experience the many different variations of the same story, whether traveling back in time as the Tinkerer, experiencing random time jumps as the Assassin, seeking fortune and, well, mostly fortune as the Sorcerer, or being trained from birth to be the tortured mercy killer of the Prophet as the Kali. The storyline can go to some very interesting places. It's a shame that with all that potential, it's often squandered and rendered completely moot by classic Nexonian problems. Out-of-place memes and references that'll do more to grind the story to a screeching violent halt than to actually immerse you in it. For instance, the Minotaur's Nest introduction has a completely unskippable DDR fight that's entirely scripted and takes all menace and credibility out of a rather intimidating-looking boss. Though, to be fair, when our blacksmith tackled our characters and screamed, "For science!" before trying to impale us with a spear, many of us got a chuckle out of it. As you progress further, you'll notice that dungeons are beginning adding more and more difficulty options. While at first this may seem to merely buff enemy health and damage, the later difficulties actually add new enemy types and mini-bosses, and often double the final boss. These challenges also increase the amount of experience and items gained from completing them, but also have a negative effect on your gear's durability. Yes, gear durability is in this game, though it seems to be implemented as an arbitrary, you completed this dungeon on this difficulty, so your gear took some damage, rather than actually being determined by your playstyle or your deaths. When each instance is complete, you can repair all your gear immediately before leaving, or simply find one of the anvils scattered throughout the world and repair it there, with fees increasing based on the level of the items repaired. Once you hit level 24, you'll be introduced to the nest system via the previously mentioned DDR cutscene. These nests usually culminate in major boss fights and have lots of mechanics to their fights, and are generally harder than the usual dungeon bosses. While these can be considered harder than the normal instances by some players, it really isn't a matter of being more difficult as it is being more cheap. Special mention goes to the Cerberus Nest, with lots of infinite stunlock enemies, attacks that cannot be avoided, and the titular boss using so much cheese that you'd think you're at a wine tasting. Nests are designed to be played multiple times over, allowing players to gain better experience and loot rewards than normal dungeons, but most importantly, taking a Monster Hunter-style approach by grinding out crafting materials to make the best gear in the game, for that level. Mounts are handled very strangely in Dragonest. You need to find the appropriate ticket to purchase the mount from the mount vendor. You know, a country girl who wishes death upon the royal girl who doesn't wear pants. You'll also get a mount for free on occasion, and they're decent enough for getting around towns. The mounts feel really odd, though, and you need to equip them to mount them up. And you can't simply dismount, because if you do, they end up back in your inventory. There's also certain things that you can't do while mounted, like steering with the WASD keys or adjusting your skills. It feels clunky and sloppy. Crafting is relatively straightforward in terms of gear and weapons. So as long as you have the materials dropped within the various nests, you simply need to find a blacksmith and choose to craft the item you want. What isn't so straightforward are the other professions within the game. Fishing, farming, and cooking, which all have been done better in other games, but luckily can pick up all 3 of these professions instead of choosing just one of them. It's highly recommended you do, as cooking requires materials from the other 2. Fishing is perhaps the most straightforward, almost boringly so. Simply have your fishing pole and bait within your inventory, look at a fishing hole you want to fish in, open up your secondary skills, and click Fish. You'll then need to hold down the left mouse button to increase line tension, keeping the bar between 2 randomly placed markers until the fish is caught. Note that even if you succeed at the minigame, you can still fail to catch a fish. Farming requires you to go find and more likely purchase seeds and then go to the public farms to find a spot to plant them. Once planted, you'll need to water your plants, but thankfully you can overload them with water and not have to keep coming back. Once they finish growing, they can be harvested. Note that this can take anywhere from 2 minutes to several days. Cooking is also straightforward, as you'll receive all the tools you need when taking the profession for the first time. Like fishing, simply open up the skills window, select the secondary skills tab, and hit the cook button. You'll need to buy recipes though, which will require specific levels of the cooking skill, and of course you'll need to gather all the resources that you need. Keep in mind that just like real life, you can fail to cook anything, so it's a shame there isn't a good takeout place nearby. All in all, the presentation is solid and the game is fun to play, but it's not without the problems of the genre. Plenty of people should be able to get into this game, and it feels far less repetitive than Vindictus or other beat-em-up MMOs. This community, well, what can be said about it that won't make somebody upset, provided they aren't already? You have plenty of people afflicted with Nexonitis, arguing this way or that, abusing the global chat via reward box pigeons to scream profanity or racist remarks, self-entitled players that will demand you move so that they can take a selfie, and perhaps worst of all, the players obsessed with their loli characters. This has led to Channel 1 of the first major town being referred to us as the Pile of Pain. That channel that must be avoided. That channel that doesn't exist. There's some generally awful things going on, with many players pimping out little girls to get likes and attention. More on that later. Random duel requests from complete strangers who will insult you and spam emotes at you if you decline, and a general lack of helpfulness. A key example of the constant dismissive tone is the oft-repeated "just check the wiki," which as it turns out is very out of date, and missing lots of information and overall relatively useless. A key note for anyone who wonders why I just don't check the wiki when looking at new games: the game needs to do a good job of explaining itself within the game. Let wikis be bastions of trivial information and min-maxer theory crafting, not an online instruction manual written by sycophants. With that said, the game does seem to want you in parties, giving buffs and bonuses to those that enter parties with friends or sign up under a mentor or join established guilds. But as mentioned before, with the game being so easy and the levels flying by so quickly until level 20, why bother? It also ends up being a hindrance when key quests and dungeons require you to be solo. Not just alone, but not in a party at all, even if the party only contains yourself. There's an unforeseen consequence to being in a party, and while naturally not everyone will have this issue, should any member of the party be lagging or crash during a loading screen, the game will physically lock the remaining party members in place until that lagging player either drops from the server or is dropped from the party, or they finish loading in. I wouldn't even say that this is common, but it did hit a Grindstone party member pretty hard at one point, so it's something to keep in mind. Also, if you're interested in the story, the party lead's character determines what the entire party will experience as a story, so be warned if you really want to see your own storyline. Speaking of Grindstone, guilds are relatively easy to start in Dragonest, with many NPCs that allow you to create one with a small investment of in-game gold, without needing a full party. The shame of it is that lower level guilds are actually far less useful for their members than higher, more established guilds. This isn't just limited to smaller amounts of storage space and players to group with, it actually affects the experience game of members who purchase special guild clothing for an experience buff. Otherwise, guilds function as you would expect them to in any other MMO. Keep in mind that the game will automatically place you in a guild as you start the game called Hero Academy, with a set of numbers after it. I'm not sure why the game does this, but you can leave that forced auto guild at any time. Backtracking slightly here, but we should talk a little bit more about that like system mentioned in the gameplay section. The system allows you to further recharge your power, allowing you to keep your expected experience and drop rates as you complete dungeons, all for the simple act of having other players leave you a like. The major issue is the way that some players garner likes, with many choosing to literally pimp out loli avatars and pets to dance in order to gain their likes faster. No, that wasn't a joke. There is a little girl pet, and she can be found in the cash shop. Time to rush in where angels fear to tread. This cash shop is pretty standard fare, though surprisingly, pay-to-win is non-existent here. This doesn't mean that anything in the store is actually worth your time, however, as everything is far too expensive for its usefulness. NX avoids Microsoft Points syndrome with its dollar values equating very easy conversions, such as $5 giving you 5,000 NX, 10 giving you 10,000, and so on up, to a maximum of 100. The item's prices themselves, though, are designed to manipulate you, rarely with anything priced at the $5 intervals, and the game will usually require you to spend more to get an item. For example, you can purchase clothing items, which will give you a small buff in PvP, but this is countered by the fact that items earned in-game are far more powerful in this regard, and that price range running from 1100 to 2200 NX for a minor buff and clothing doesn't really look all that great. You can get a full set instead of buying them individually, but this will cost you a staggering 30,600 NX, or $30.60 if you could pay for it outright. However, remember that you'll still need to purchase the $20 and the $10 and the $5 in order to get enough points, or just drop $50 outright. Another stat-boosting item is the pets. As mentioned, there's Little Winnie, the small girl pet, and various animals. These not only will give you a buff to your stats, but will automatically pick up loot and money when you're inside dungeons, and will gain experience that increases their effectiveness at both tasks. Pets range from 3,300 NX to 8,500. Naturally, they're the standard lucky boxes found in almost every MMO these days, so nothing really new to add about them here. The usual storage space and character slot unlocks are perhaps the most useless given the sheer number of slots that you get for free. items to protect your gear during reinforcement, scrolls that will allow you to resurrect on your own, experience boosters, items to see the random treasure chest at the end of each dungeon to get the rarity you want, respec scrolls, and the game's megaphones, which come in blue for World Shout and yellow for Field Shout. There's the debatably useful dual skill scroll, which will unlock another skill tree that you can change builds easily, but it costs 14,900 NX points and can be hardly considered a must-have or even an impulse buy at such a price. All in all, the cash shop is really a take-it-or-leave-it affair, and I wouldn't find anything that screams must-have, especially for the silly prices, and you can safely ignore it if you just want to play the game. DRAGONEST can certainly be a bit of fun, but it seems to run out of steam quickly when played for long periods. We had plenty of players reaching max level or close to it and then just stopping, feeling no real need to continue, which I feel is really the nature of the beast for this kind of gameplay. Still, I feel it's a really solid beat-em-up style game, and despite the Nexonian miasma that hangs over it, you can get some friends together and find yourself a nice secluded channel, you'll have fun for short bursts of time. Here's my final rating. It scares me how good this game actually looks. Well, aside from whatever the hell they did to the facial textures. They bug me to a ridiculous fault, but it's not like I'm going to put that in the past section. Despite the faces, the whole game has a very coherent and fanciful look, with well-placed textures and models, and little hints of brilliance that go above and beyond what's expected from a title like this. Adding to the visual quality is the style and action of the combat, something you'd likely come to expect from any anime-styled game. Combos and moves feel fun, fast, and satisfying, and there was something cathartic about being able to knock over an enemy to the ground, stand over it, and pummel it into dust. The style and nature of the genre allows it to be a rather simple game to play for the fun of it. You can log in, play for a few dungeons, and head out without feeling lost or behind the curve the next time you get on. Since I don't really tend to place value on any kind of boosters, the only notable items in the shop are the costumes and the pets. Although the costumes do offer stats, and while the argument can be made that this is a pay-to-win kind of a thing, many outfits are earnable in-game with the best stats only obtainable through that way. It really depends on what you'd rather look like. The same goes for pets, as they offer up stat boosts as well, but their most useful feature is the ability to retrieve items for you and save on all that clicking. You know, unless you plan on running some sort of creepy dance service with one of them. And the fact I had to write that previous sentence should make it obvious why I would list the community as a pass point. The thing is that they're not so much intrusive, but they are unquestionably Nexonian. Such weeb, very maple. You likely won't have to rely on them, and it's easy enough to just avoid them, so consider it a light pass point. More likely to make you leave is the repetitive nature of the genre. After a while, things feel samey in beat-em-ups, and it's hard for people to play something like this endlessly, especially once they see the patterns and the formulas emerge. It's probably best to play this in short bursts to avoid burnout. However, it's easier to burn out on this because it's just so easy. We were repeatedly promised, oh, it gets harder when you do this, or it gets harder when you reach here, but not one of us felt any sort of challenge based on mechanics or tactics, with the only exception being a wave-based bonus dungeon that you can tackle as early as level 15. For the most part, you can enter a dungeon, send it to the highest difficulty, reach the boss that has 3 health bars worth of life to burn through, and kill it with only 2 skills. Anticlimactic, to say the least. After a while, it feels more like slaying through mooks in a Dynasty Warriors title, and without the occasional cheap boss that relies on infinite stun locks to cheese its way to victory, the hardest parts of the game come down to whether or not you can out-cheese the AI. And that's not difficulty, it's lazy frustration. Next time, well, if you've been following any MMO news, you probably know what's coming, especially considering it's happening tomorrow. Hey, thanks for sticking around to watch all of MMO Grinder. If you're new here and I didn't make you angry with this video, you can see the last episode of MMO Grinder by clicking on that left window. And if you'd like to check out some of my side content, I do a first impression show on betas and trials I call Side Quest. You can check out the latest episode on an upcoming game called Otherland by clicking that window on the right. Of course, you can simply subscribe to the channel or follow my Twitter accounts for updates, or my random ranting of whatever stupid crap I'm on about that day. Couple of shoutouts from my show supporters. First up, Slipstream would like you all to check out his Twitch channel, where he's streaming for the sake of streaming and trying to keep up more of a regular presence on Twitch. You can check him out at twitch.tv/slipstreamx14. Finally, Michael Foy may not have anything he'd like to promote for himself, but he urges you to check out Ross Fairies and his community site over at paradiseandfairies.com. There you can find all sorts of online reviews and videos for all things anime and video games. Links for those in the description.